All right, Gunther, welcome.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. I have been a fan of yours for some time, so it's quite an honor.
I hope I don't disappoint you in
Well,
reality.
I'm sure you won't.
Impossible,
I'm
Gunther. Thank you for
I'm just
joining us.
real.
Disappointing us. Impossible. Well, we might ask you to do some like exercises, like with some dumbbells, and
I'm ready.
you're ready. Oh, awesome. Awesome. So where are you right now in your workout routine? I remember seeing this following your feed. You decided to get back in shape and stuff like that. But what are some of your gains and all that stuff?
I was challenged by one guy because I took the family name of my wife, and so I had this challenge to get 54 push-ups by my
Uh-huh.
birthday in 2 weeks. But sadly, I'm going to fail because I never pushed over 45. So that's my current position.
So 45 straight push-ups without a break.
Yes.
That's pretty good. I mean,
It's,
that's good stuff.
I'm not a Olympic athlete, but an
Right.
economist.
Yes.
So ultimately, it's a kind of midlife crisis, which I try to get over with my sports activities. So I'm not a professional athlete. So it's okay. I think it's also, it's a decent part of life's activity to also keep yourself in shape and not
Yes.
to be a fat presidential candidate or
Right.
somebody like that.
That's true. That's true. No,
I try
I
to.
try to do something every day, and
Yes.
you realize how important it is. Just even if it's just walking the dog for a mile, that's something, or going to the gym, that's something. Going for a hike for, 5 miles or so, that's a lot actually. And it's just once you stop doing that daily routine, things start to kind of collapse on you and you become old and you become slow and fat and you think life's over and things like that. But just working keeps you, loving life.
I actually like it as a daily routine. It's
Hmm.
fun, and I like also progress on that one. And also, when you are in this social media activities, it's also that a lot of young people are there, and I also
Yeah.
want to be a little bit in that way. Also encourage everybody to do something, and so that's part of the activity. And also, it's a little bit entertainment, infotainment. So I
Yeah.
do it for that reason also. From time to time, when I'm criticized, I make a challenge online. And so it's part of the fun of the social media
Yeah.
activities.
Well, you're not afraid to be criticized. And I'll get this in this. So we're now at 2 p.m. Eastern time. So officially welcome Gunther Fehlinger-Jahn. And you're I this is a bit of a dream come true to have you because I feel like I've known you through social media for some time. So and you've definitely been inspiring. So
Yes.
um uh, welcome. So, for anyone out there who doesn't know too much about you or coming to you for the first time, could you introduce yourself and I am curious about your own kind of personal background, how you got here. But first, just introduce yourself and um, let us know a little bit about you.
It's simple. My name is Gunther Fehlinger and now Fehlinger-Jahn since the
Hmm.
marriage. And I'm an Austrian economist. I studied economics at the Austrian University of Economics in Vienna. And I'm active in economic reform in Europe in various positions since 30 years. My focus is Eastern Europe. I worked in Kosovo, Ukraine, and Albania, North Macedonia, and before in Brussels. And my lifelong passion is basically a strong European Union, a strong NATO, and the defeat of all these dictatorship regimes of Russia and the nationalists of Serbia, Iran, and all this. And my economic beliefs, my political beliefs is easily it's summed up. I'm pro-American, transatlantic, pro-NATO,
Hmm.
pro-low taxes, pro-flat tax in the optimum, and I'm for the euro. I'm for OECD, WTO, and all these organizations to be active and successful and I'm whatever. I reject any form of genocide, brutality, and this form of nationalistic war waging Eastern powers. I really reject, and I'm unapologetic pro NATO. And I think it's very good for all European countries to be part of it.
I agree with everything you just said. So you're a little bit older than I am. You're in your mid 50s. Is that correct?
I have my birthday next week,
Next
56.
week? 56. So
Yes.
you've got 10 years on me. That's good. 10 years of experience. Um, so could you talk a little bit about growing up in Austria and then how you came to these positions as well? Because I mean, I was born in 1978, and I can remember the Cold War to some degree, learning about it in lower school, and I can remember Ronald Reagan a little bit, and I can actually remember really distinctly going Christmas shopping with my mother in Neiman Marcus in Dallas, Texas, and they were actually selling pieces of the Berlin Wall for Christmas. You could put in a stocking, whether those were fake or not. Who knows? But it was maybe a little bit too perfect of the end of history. You're selling off communism for people for housewives in Texas for Christmas. Um, but most of my life, of course, has been after 1989, 1991. But anyway, I'm just kind of curious about your feelings as a younger person growing up in Austria, like your perspective on the Cold War as a child.
I was born in Linz and I went to school in Linz. And
Hmm.
it was in the 80s, basically, when I was in high school. And it was always, we were somewhere in this gray zone. We were neutralized by the Soviets after the end of the Second World War. We were occupied first, liberated and occupied.
Hmm.
And we were always in between. And it was very difficult position. We were much poorer than the Germans. We were not fully in the West. We were somehow a neutral territory in the Cold
Hmm.
War border. And Austria is a small country. In all borders, basically, we were closed in because in the south there was Yugoslavia. That was also complicated. You could go, but it was a difficult partner, neighbor. But then in the east and in the north of Austria, there was the Czechoslovak Republic and there was Hungary. And it was not possible to go. It was dangerous. It was the enemies. It was the Soviet Union on the other side. And for me, it was always very clear this is the enemy. Russia has occupied these countries, and Russia is threatening us again with basically potential invasion. And so for me, Ronald Reagan was the savior. And my most
Hmm.
happy moments were when then the Eastern system, the Soviet system, broke down. And I then traveled very often, 7 times in the 90s to Russia to see myself how everything is working. And I was then, as a student leader, student activist, I traveled all over Eastern Europe and it was emerging. And I saw with my own eyes how terrible the system in Romania was, for example, when the people were malnutritioned of my generation and had no teeth because of malnutrition. And you could visibly see the scars of the dictatorship in their faces. And I
Mm.
was in the Soviet Union still in 1990. And I saw it, the hygienic situation, the nutrition situation, the basic urban development, the civil society development. It was all an absolute disaster. So communism really has left nothing good. And also before I was a convinced anti-communist, but it also then when I saw how terrible the situation all over the places were, so I was a convinced anti-communist for all my life, and
Mm.
so nobody should tell me something to go back to any kind of times. And everything the Soviets have brought was absolutely disaster. And the last, basically, I devoted my last 30, 40 years of my professional life also to, in one way or the other, to help the integration of the former Soviet occupied countries into the European Union, into NATO, into Euro, into the Western system. And still, I'm doing that today, even with the more complicated countries like Ukraine and Kosovo and Albania. Of course, this is more complicated than with Czech Republic and Poland and all the others, where there was much more substance from pre-war times ahead. and they were also more economically integrated and developed in the communist times. So I have devoted my life for that, and now I see the results. When you go, for example, through Prague, Bratislava, Bucharest, Budapest, it's very developed places already. Not
Hmm.
fully on our standards, but we have achieved enormous things the last 30 years
Oh
with
yeah.
American help, but with the institutions we have. And thanks for that. And we have to be proud about it, and we have to defend it. And not
Hmm.
plan somebody like Jackson Hickel being American communist leader, and knowing the world by his millions of followers. I don't know how he does that. But, then I saw all these people on Twitter and social media because of my children, basically. They also introduced me to this world. And some years ago, then I think it was basically 2018, 19, I started to have a much more active profile also on Twitter and to fight all this kind of negative propaganda and all these Russian positions. And here I am.
Well, I have a number of questions, but let me just start throwing out a couple of them. Do you think when I was in Germany in the 2000s, there was a word called Ostalgie, which was nostalgia for the East. And there was actually a couple of movies that came out at the time about, the day-day air. Oh, it wasn't that bad. It was kind of cute. And Western capitalism. And I think these are legitimate criticism that actually Western capitalism can be soulless. It's too much about grabbing from money and not enough about tradition and so on. I think those are legit criticisms. Now to the answer to that being, well, I get it. The answer to that being return to communism because it was so brutal and oppressive that we were kind of grounded in the sense of being grounded down into mush or something. I don't think is the right answer. But there was that. Do you think someone what do you think about Hinkle? Let's use him as an example. Do you think there's a genuine nostalgia among young people where they just simply want to revolt against the West and everything that it represents, and they reach back to like an older enemy, the Soviet Union? Or do you think he's simply a hollow man who's being paid by the Kremlin? Or is it
Yes.
a combination? Or what do you think is going on there? Because he has more followers than you and I do. So there is something. I mean, what is it? What is he tapped into, or what are his handlers trying to promote?
Look, on a more serious basis, yeah, the
Hmm.
Jackson and this Hinkle, yeah, and the situation is that there is, of course, the need to constantly explain the history and the reality, because all this kind of also nationalistic, also populistic, also this kind of communistic, socialist, they all have a certain narrative which might be attractive if it's nicely told. And it can be
Right.
always leading, you see it in these race riots in the UK, you see it now in Eastern Germany with this rise of the extreme left and extreme right. There is a certain base for that, yeah, because
Yeah.
the story of equality and of brotherhood, let's call it brotherhood or nationhood, yeah, is somehow a nice one. It sounds nice, yeah.
Hmm.
Solidarity, equality, yeah, we are all equal, yeah, we are exploited by somebody. Somebody
Right. We're all
abuses us.
equal
This,
because we're all in the same prison,
yeah,
basically.
exactly.
Yeah.
It somehow sounds nice, yeah. And generation by generation, what I criticize our politicians, yeah, we cannot, because we won the Cold War, say, hey, we have done victory and it's over and out, and we don't have to explain anything anymore, yeah, and just continue to be happy, yeah. No, you have to explain why we won. We have to explain why it was good to win and why
Hmm.
actually we won, that it was a victory in the Cold War, that there were two competing systems, two political, economic, social systems competing brutally all around the globe in a global confrontation for over 40 years. And still we are basically in that one, because the Putin system is basically the inheritance, the legacy system of the Soviet Union. And what we
Yeah.
face today is basically nothing else than a continuation of the Cold War under different circumstances. And everything is a little bit different, of course, because we are now 30 years onwards and we have a different confrontation. But basically, this global system competition is still ongoing. And we have to explain why we won it. And we have to be preparing each generation again that it was right to win, that we
Hmm.
won because we are good, because we are
Hmm.
the morally superior, more productive, and more beneficial system for the people. That's why we won ultimately. And then because also we were working for it. We were waging a war. We were winning it. We were also doing all the efforts in field of industry, technology, economic systems. And we have basically also had the better strategy. And so ultimately our system was performing better and we won the Cold War. And this is absolutely right thing to do because the socialist system was a system of oppression, dictatorship,
Hmm.
of horrors, untold horrors. And I met many of the victims. And you have more today on each YouTube channel, you can see the victims of communism, how it was in the Eastern Germany Stasi system or in the gulags or everywhere. And you can simply go there and talk to the people because now most of these countries are liberated and part of the free world. And that some people have some nostalgia about the past. Look, it's a deeply human thing to be a little bit nostalgic about your own youth. There is nothing bad
Sure.
about it because you think that, I'm now 56 and then I also think that 30 years I was a little bit younger and a little bit, everything without with less responsibilities and I have found memories of the past. And so every individual has that more or less, yeah. And so we all think why and how and why everything ages now. And
Hmm.
you are a little bit, so it's a human thing, but it shouldn't be a societal phenomenon that anybody is happy and looking backward for Yugoslavia or Eastern Germany, all these failed systems, or worst of all, the Soviet Union, which is the mother of evil. It was
Yeah.
the most historic tragedy of our history that the German emperor ultimately, because of the two front wars in the First World War, and they have made this strategy to support the communists, and they have transported Lenin back to this Russian Empire. They funded him with millions of German marks, or whatever was the
Hmm.
currency then, and they have really managed to install the system in a historic coincidence, tragedy, accident. And then, since 1970 or 1918, ultimately, and the Russian Civil War, we have this most powerful country with most resources in the world, the Russian Empire, dominated by this terrible KGB philosophy, and they have been able to basically influence or dominate half of the world for some period, and now they are in their last death convulsions, basically.
Hmm.
I'm very hopefully that Ukraine ultimately will defeat them and Russia will be dismantled, as I have said on many of my Twitter feeds already. But this is obviously now to be seen. But it's very good if such a terrible regime will be defeated, and obviously also their ideological base must be defeated in the West, in America, and in Europe, and hopefully the atrocities Russia is doing in Ukraine these days is also contributing significantly to the reduction of all sympathies for socialism, communism, Putinism, and all these things.
Do you think that Putinism is the Soviet Union almost without any ideology or Marxism? Because it clearly has inherited all of the structures, the KGB under a new name, et cetera, et cetera. But it almost lacks any real intellectual attraction in the sense that we can acknowledge that Marxism was attractive. It attracted many of the brightest lights of intelligent from the intelligentsia of Western Central Europe and America. Putinism does not, because there's no there. It is almost a sort of zombie or kind of like taxidermy, if you know what that is, a stuffed animal of the Cold War that's persisting, and it's persisting through natural resources, but there's no real engine there. And I think whatever problems there are in the West, and there is much about contemporary America or Western Europe, whatever, that drives me crazy. And we're a kind of end of history culture. We're not having children and families. We're not moving forward. We don't believe in it. So all that thing is correct. But to compare that to Russia, the West seems fulfilling and bright and has a future. But I think maybe both of these empires are sort of suffering from the same thing. It's like Putinism is the Soviet Union without an ideology, without Marxism. So it becomes mere brutality and depression. And maybe the West is almost having a little bit of an identity crisis of its own. But what do you think of that characterization?
Absolutely, it's very correct. I'm not so negative on the West actually, but let's come
Oh.
first to the Putin system. You know, Putin is a trained KGB agent. Yeah,
Yeah.
he was until 35. He was a trained hierarchy in a younger position, in a junior position. But when you are 35, you are a trained individual, and he always was a KGB person. And
Hmm.
basically, what is very important to understand is that it was a kind of a civil war in Russia in the 90s. Yeah, and it is one of the tragedies that this civil wars in the year between 98 and 2000 was won by exactly that group, which was the most brutal of all options. Yeah? And it was
Hmm.
Putin winning with the Chechenian war and with all his intrigues in these 2 years when he was in Moscow from 89 to from 98 to 2000. And he won basically, and his group has won. And that's why basically we have this persiflage of the Soviet Union. It's of course always trying to find a new basis for legitimacy. It's no longer communism alone, but they always have tried nationalism. They have tried this orthodox church extremism. They
Yeah.
try, or they have tried a certain form of successful copy of crony capitalism. They have tried to extend their legitimacy basis in various forms, but they have never fully built a kind of successful governance systems, I think so. And now Putin tried to do this Ukraine invasion by basically finding a new form of legitimacy. And now he
Yeah.
fails completely. So that's why I think that he will completely fail, because his efforts to find a justification for his governance, he's now imposed himself from 99 to 2024, and I think can constitutionally go on to 36 or something. So what is it? Is it a monarchy or what?
Yeah.
Is it a new Tsar empire? You know, it's totally overblown to orient such a system so much at one person, and there is no other basis of justification. So he basically had to continuously invent one national crisis, one war by the next, yeah, in
Hmm.
order to somehow legitimize the necessity for his one-man rule. And of course, it's a complete disaster. And I guess, I hope actually, I pray it will fall apart now very soon, and there will be liberation of all the people inside Russia.
Well, we'll definitely talk about that. But what were some of the possibilities for Russia? Um, Certainly after 89 to 91. And also, you were talking about various ways that Putin sought to legitimize himself.
Yeah.
One of those ways was being the West, basically. I mean, 20 some years ago, Putin was getting along with George W. Bush. I mean, he was fighting the Chechen War. He was kind of pitching that as a sort of war on terror of sorts, and so on. But he was viewed largely as maybe not perfect, but a someone bringing in capitalism and Western values, the best of what is possible, and we should, looking westward. He actually gave a speech at the Konrad Adenauer Institute in German. He spoke German due to his time in Dresden, but he gave a speech of reaching out. I mean, were all of those things smokescreens, or
Yes. Yes.
were there legitimate, other
No.
possibilities?
This is a big debate also in Germany, and you are very
Hmm.
right to pose it. But the thing is, he was never a positive or good person. Never
Right.
forget the way he came to power. He has artificially basically launched a war of aggression on his own breakaway Republic of Chechnya in 99.
Hmm.
So he became to prime minister in 99 in August, yeah. And on 1st of October, he launched a war against his own. This is like whatever the United States government attacking Hawaii or something and bombing him
Hmm.
brutally and killing all the people. Or it's of
Well, we
course
did
a bit
sort
of
of do that in the 1860s,
a.
but go on.
I appreciate your
Yeah.
self-criticism, but it was
Yeah.
more a small coup.
Right.
Never, I don't think anybody in Hawaii was bombarded. Yeah.
Right.
Anyhow, nevertheless, Chechnya was a brutal war, and it was really an invasion of our own territory with all
Hmm.
brutality, and so many people died. And basically, this kind of guy has then become the president, and he had a very small legitimate basis. Yeah, he
Hmm.
needed to build coalition still internally. So there is a phase of Putin in the beginning when he was very weak still. He had a lot of internal disasters, like, for example, this Kursk submarine sinking. And so he needed to reach out to his internal kind of groups. And he had also a period where, for example, with Nemtsov, he tried to copy some of the economic liberal ideas, which I also like. Under
Hmm.
his presidency, there was also the flat tax introduced, and there was administrative reform introduced, and a lot of the anti somehow deregulation. This was all also him in terms of, but it was a kind of a greater coalition which he had to do in order to build a majority in the parliament when he was still weaker
Hmm.
politically. And also on the world level, he had to go to the American president and also to the Germans to build some recognition for his regime. So he was presenting him softer, but it was still the same guy who just came back with his bloody hands from Chechnya.
Right.
It was the same guy. And we have basically looked away when he killed the Chechens, his own citizens. Yeah? I repeat it, was not a tribe somewhere or somehow. These were his own citizens who were basically already free in 94. And he killed them on droves with military means and bombarded the cities. And we looked a little bit away because we didn't really know and looked a little bit suspicious. Muslims, Chechenians might be dangerous. It's not our business. And we also were attracted by these enormous opportunities which Russia has to offer. Let's not forget, Russia, the Russian Empire controls whatever 1/7 of the Earth's space and
Right.
controls, of course, enormous energy and mineral resources, which everybody, of course, understood that, we can make good business here if there is one guy who is ready for business. So we closed both eyes. We said yes to business also because we wanted to have stability in Eastern Europe and in Russia. We wanted not to have chaos as a West. Yeah. And
Hmm.
so that's, of course, we sold it was what the Germans famously call a Faustian bargain. You make a deal with the devil and you get stability. And we got some stability, yeah,
Hmm.
for some decades. And we got also a lot of cheap resources. And this immoral kind of business was the principles of our foreign policy during that period. And the US was focusing very much on Iraq and Afghanistan. So they needed to have quiet in Eastern Europe.
Hmm.
And so that was convenient also for the Americans. And in Europe, we needed the energy. So we basically sold human rights and values on the business market of energy and somehow cooperation, more or less, because in reality the Russians were always aiding to our enemies in Iraq and Afghanistan, as we now see very openly. The Taliban are very clearly an ally of Russia.
Hmm.
Assad is an ally of Russia, and all this. Abbas, for example, is today in Moscow to hold negotiations. So, they were never really honest partners of the West in terms of the Middle East, the Russians.
It, after
But it was good.
1991, do you think
Yeah.
more should have been done, or is Russia sort of this puzzle that you can't solve in the
That's
sense
a
that I mean, it's a difficult question, and I you might be of mixed mind on it. I mean, Jeffrey Sachs, who now seems to be an almost pro-Putin apologist, right? He drives you up a tree. But he's been criticized before that as the shock therapy being too much. It needed to be a slower evolution or something like that. And maybe due to the American elections, where you every 4 years you got to run for office, you have different guys coming in, and the public is distracted. There wasn't any sort of long-term patience to reform Russia. I mean, what is it an impossible task, or what are your feelings on what happened immediately after the Soviet Union?
This is also a very important debate, and I've made a lot of thinking about it already. You know,
Hmm.
there's a lot of scholars who say we were not doing enough or we were doing the wrong things. I think, you know, the situation in the year 88 to 92, it was very tumultuous.
Yeah.
We had all of Eastern Europe opening. We had the German unification. We had the start of the Yugoslavian war. We have the breakup of the Soviet Union. You know, this was basically a lot of opportunities and a little bit of chaos. And I think what we have done as a West, was very good. We first of all have concentrated what really can be saved and what can be secured for the long term, if you want. This is Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe was, of course, sacrificed after World War II towards the Soviets, and now it was coming back, and they were opening, and this was an enormous task financially. It was an
Hmm.
enormous task in terms of political attention, advisory, to reform and open countries and integrate them into the European Union. Countries from the Estonia to Romania to Bulgaria, and the conditions were enormously difficult. I was visiting and partly living in many of the countries in the last 30 years, and the conditions were really and are partly still very difficult. So this was an enormous task, and it took a lot of attention. Yugoslavia was going up in flames. The civil war and the breakup war was coming. And then, of course, the Soviet Union was 15 countries then, but it was a very difficult process. From Lithuania to Azerbaijan to Georgia to Estonia, there was always a flare-up. There was unclarity if the Soviet Union will use violence even in Eastern Germany. Will the
Sure.
Soviet Union use violence in Czech Republic? Will the Soviet Union and they used violence in Lithuania or in Georgia
Hmm.
or in Azerbaijan? So in reality, also, when everything was clear in 91, there was a major American-led effort to reform Russia, a major,
Hmm.
major. But look at what Russia was. Russia was in 93 basically in a civil war. I mean,
Hmm.
Yeltsin first of all, Yeltsin has in 91 saved Russia or created Russia. In 93, he attacked the parliament, in a civil
Hmm.
war, militarily. And then 96, the elections of him totally drunken, being supported by the oligarchs. So Russia was basically in a constant civil war, which unfortunately the groups which we supported, the center right wing, the reformers, the Nemtsovs, the Gaidars, they have basically lost. And they have lost the civil wars against there was the other section was the communists, and the third one was the Putin faction. So could we have done more? You know, it's always in the hindsight. You could have said, let's neglect Eastern Europe and send all the advisors and all the monies just to Russia. But it wouldn't have saved the situation, because there was much more will to the West in the Eastern Europe. There was a
Hmm.
will to the West in Croatia, because ultimately what we are talking here is very much, is there a national will to be part of the free world? And this was there in Poland, this was there in Romania, this was there in Croatia, but it's not there in Russia. Why? Because the elite there was quite happy for many decades to run the world. If you
Yeah.
are in Moscow and you are the part and the elite, and this is also some segments of the society, and you are the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union runs half the world and the rest is afraid of her, you feel quite happy. So basically, there was never this kind of will to be part of the free world there. So we basically we have sent a lot of advisors. We have sent, I think the number is 30 billion euros. The US and the EU has put to Russia in the 90s. Okay, we could have sent 300 billion in retrospect. But I think we would have still lost the civil war, because there was
Yeah.
too much of an electorate in the elite in Russia, where they saw that actually when we go anti-West, we can have our own world carved out for us, and we will be much more successful and we don't have to submit to the free world order in a sense. And this electorate was there, and this has basically won. And with this kind of smooth maneuvering of Putin, they could, in a way, re-establish themselves to enormous power. And it took 20 years and the Ukraine war for them to basically run their own systems against the wall, because without the Ukraine war and this crazy project of Putin, they would still be a dominant factor in the world politics. And it's just their defeat now, the battlefield of Ukraine, which diminishes Russia to a minor factor in world politics.
What is your vision for a post-Ukraine war Russia? You mentioned breaking up Russia into certainly an example like Chechnya being obvious where that could be an autonomous
Absolutely.
region. But what
Independent
is your
state.
vision, and is there a will to implement that?
Look, it's a political project I'm fighting for. There's
Hmm.
many options. The Russian opposition leaders, like the ones who were just released, yeah, Kara Mustafa, yeah, this gentleman, he is, of course, and others, or Kasparov and Khodorkovsky, and they want to have a united free Russia, basically federation of free states which are working similar like the United States of America. This is
Hmm.
one way. It's possible. Of course, nobody really hopes there will be some kind of Putin son or a grandson taking over and running it on a Napoleonic basis. Yeah, and that would
Right.
be very bad. I and my friends, we have basically this idea of 41 new independent states according to the Yugoslavian breakup model, which of course many people also don't like because they say it's very dangerous because of nuclear power and because of all these border wars and the conflicts in between. But I think in the long run, this is the much better potential for the future of Russia.
Hmm.
We also have a Twitter feed on that one, the Forum of the Post-Russian Nations. And when you look in the history, we had a British Empire, a French Empire, Portuguese Empire, and they all broke up. They had a lot of possessions globally, and there were a lot of people who didn't like that, and it was always seen as a fact. And when you see in the Russian history, you have a lot of different nations, from the Chechenians most famously, but also
Hmm.
you have a lot of Uyghur tribes, you have a lot of the Turkish tribes, you have a lot of Mongolian nations, you have everything in Russia. And we made a process with the participants of that forum themselves, where we basically have asked them for designing what kind of nationhood they would have, and it resulted in these 41 independent nations, which they think is the best scenario, which of course has a little bit of tilt from Ukraine, because it's one of the strategies of the Ukrainian side to undermine the Russian unity, to show how diverse and fragile this empire is. But
Hmm.
I think after having met now several of the opposition activists from Chechnya, from Ingushetia, from Dagestan, from Buryatia, for example, or from Sakha in Asia. They all look very differently. They have very different languages. They have all the cases. And honestly, I know it's very controversial what I say, but what is our stake to fight for Russian unity?
Right.
I mean, this
Well,
is.
I mean, this is one of the interesting thing. I get it. This is one of the interesting things about George Herbert Walker Bush and the famous Chicken Kiev speech where he was saying, "Don't get too excited here. Yes, we fought this Cold War and we've in some ways imagined defeating the commies on some level, but let's not actually do it because that would create so much instability. It is a regional, at the very least, power. This is how we do things geopolitically. Let's not get ahead of ourselves." And I think a lot of American thinking is still in that direction. They sort of can't imagine a world without Russia as a nuclear power. And certainly, if you look at Russian television as an example of state propaganda, they can't imagine it either. They'll go on there, oh, we might nuke Poland or nuke Britain. We'll see. We'll nuke Nebraska. Who knows? They can't get out of that 20th century mentality of being important. And it's in a way kind of sad. It's almost like Norma Desmond, if you've ever seen the movie Sunset Boulevard, still believing she's a star when there's no real basis for that in the sense of the Soviet Union as an attractive, aggressive empire. There's no basis for this. Putinism is not attractive to anyone. I think Putin might have even imagined Ukrainians laying down their arms and submitting, and it was just there's proof that no one wants to go back, or no one, it's not even back. No one wants to go there in the sense of being integrated into Russia. But anyway, let me ask you this: how would you solve the big daddy of questions, which is the nuclear question? So you to go back to Chicken Kiev. Eventually, Ukraine, although it did acquire some sort of sovereignty, they delivered the nuclear weapons to the Russian Federation. And so that was a monumentally important decision. Maybe you could say a monumental mistake, but it happened. But how do you solve this issue? Would all of these nations, these 41 nations you're imagining, would they be neutralized? Would
Look, let's start a debate like this. America has built this world order like it is today. And you
mm-hmm,
want to keep it because you fought for it in the World War II. And
mm-hmm,
basically, without your financial industrial resources, the Soviet Union would have been beaten. And, Hitler would have won. It would have taken impossible efforts for the rest of the world to defeat Nazism. So you have done it, financially, technically, and with the blood of many Americans being sent over. So you built afterwards a new world order, which is the UN, NATO, and all
mm-hmm,
these other institutions, ultimately the EU, the OECD, and the Marshall Plan, and all these things you did, yeah? But you said to the European partners from the beginning, we built it according to to American principles, yeah?
right,
American values. That meant decolonization. Because remember, in the 50s, the British Empire was ruling half of the world, and
sure,
the French wanted the rest back, and the
mm-hmm,
Dutch and everybody, And you said, no, 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 this is not going to happen,
mm-hmm,
We will not defend your world order, but it's our world order, the American one, and not the European imperialist one. And so one by one, the whole of Africa was led into independence, This has
mm-hmm,
51 new states, Half of Asia was led into independence. Sadly, in the process, because of many issues, you lost some of these countries towards the Soviet Union, and they turned out to be very terrible regimes. Angola, Cuba, there's many
mm-hmm,
examples like that. But of course, overall, ultimately, you won. But this was your decision to decolonize the world, and you did it. You imposed it on the rest of the world. When it came then the end of the Cold War in the year we talked already, these decisive years of 89 to 91, then you were sending Mr. George Bush, a great hero and one of the greatest presidents, the father, towards Kiev, and told them, wait a little bit with independence,
right,
because we own
right,
this world order and it's a bit chaotic and there are nuclear weapons in place. And, actually, we don't know Ukraine so much and why exactly you should be independent. Because
mm-hmm,
there's no reason, that's a lot of expensive. And, he said in Chicken Kiev. And his foreign minister, other gentleman I really admire, also a very tough politician and gentleman, James Baker, he was sent to Yugoslavia to do a similar tour through all the capitals and say, unity is very fine,
mm-hmm,
because it's much more easier with us. We have anyhow subsidized Yugoslavia since 50s, because Yugoslavia was somewhere in between. And so we want no independence wars. And what happened? Ukraine opted for independence 2 weeks later, after Bush
mm-hmm,
left and James Baker left, and the whole of the Balkans erupted in flames. And ultimately, your foreign policy establishment was, oh no, we don't like that.
mm-hmm,
And ultimately, you had to like it because Ukraine turned to the West, you supported it. The Baltic countries turned to the West, you supported it. And you had anyhow to sort out the mess. And you had also later, when the going was going very tough in Yugoslavia, You had to support Slovenia. You had to support Croatia. Because
Mm-hmm.
why? You want to let them killed by the Serbs? No. And basically then they ran all to Washington and said, support us, we will be good people. You had then control of the activities, obviously, and you transformed these countries into Western countries, and Estonia and Croatia are now NATO allies, actually thanks to George W. Bush, a gentleman.
Mm-hmm.
I also like him very much because he was very interested in NATO enlargement affairs, and he did it all right. So in a short version, what I want to say about the future of Russia is, guys, the future is not absolutely decided. The future
Mm-hmm.
is always unclear. And these things are not depending on the American opinion makers and the youth. If they think, I see some of their guys here quoting, this is unrealistic, this is dangerous. Yeah,
Right.
but it's not you acting as the sole actor, or you are not the one superpower who really decides everything in the world. You are, of course, the one superpower who has to keep the world order together. But when the Chechenians want to be free, and they will fight for their freedom, they will die for for their freedom, and you will have the choice to sacrifice them again, like you did in 94 and 99, or to support them. And when all the nations of Russia at the same time say, after a big defeat and complete chaos, that they want to break up and want to form independent nations, who in the world, no American president, no CIA, no kind of young diplomat from America can go to whatever took Tatarstan and say, Kazan, no.
Mm-hmm.
If they declared, you will have to, it took many years for America to accept Macedonia, you to accept Croatia. It was a little bit longer, but for Macedonia, it was a 3 years process for recognition. Yeah? And then
Mm-hmm.
you grudgingly excited, yes, we do it. Yeah. So I say the future is not decided. It very much depends on these people, how bad the situation is. Do they see a future ahead of them? And I don't say no, neutralization. Why shouldn't they? If they are in the European continent, I was sitting in the European Parliament next to speakers from St. Petersburg who said they want to join NATO and the EU. And what's fundamentally wrong with that?
Mm-hmm.
They are a very European city. And if the Chechenians want to come, I would say, let's see, EU. But for NATO, if they apply, we have Turkey in NATO. It's, of course, a difficult partner, but I wouldn't exclude any of that because I'm not full of wisdom to see the future. If they
Mm-hmm.
want to stay united and if they want to form a new Russia, it's also completely fine for me because anyhow, who will listen to me? They will certainly not call me, Gunther. Can we stay united? But they will also
Right.
not call you if they
Right.
have decided for independence because they hate Moscow and they feel economically exploited. They feel abused because the children die on the Ukraine battlefield. If they think that Putin is a bastard and we want to be free of Moscow colonial submission. And if they decide that, then they will do it and they will just send you the letter asking for recognition. And then you can say, ooh, the nukes. Yes, you said it the same in 91. And by
Right.
the way, there was no nuclear war in 91. And the nuclear power has dismantled itself, dissolved itself into 50 new states, 15. That was what the Soviet Union was breaking up. And the nukes were simply transferred to Russia. And a similar process is exactly now possible as well, because the more realistic picture than 41 new states is, of course, that central Russia, that with Moscow as a capital, will
Mm-hmm.
basically lose all its periphery. That means the Asia, Siberia, and all these Asian republics, they will basically go and declare independence. Yeah? And also everything in the south, there's a lot there as well in the Caucasus, and maybe in the north as well. And there is an ethnic base, there is a own identity, there is a own history. Of course, there is, of course, a lot of Moscow brutality because in
Mm-hmm.
the history of Russia, when you go back to the Russian Civil War, you had already a independent Siberia. You had an independent, whatever, not Chechnya, but you had several of these independent states already, but neither the West was ready to recognize them, and some of the advisors of Kolchak who was in Siberia, He had the money of the Russian Tsar. He had this Czechoslovakian Legion. He could have easily said, I go for independence of Siberia. And some people produced it on him, but he was an imperial Russian general. And he said, no, no, the Tsar, no, no, Russia. And so he was defeated because basically the central Russia, and that's the whole history of Russia, here is the most population density, and they can easily extend towards the east and the south and kill everybody who is opposing them. And that's also in a short version the history of Russian colonialism, because it was bloody wars where Russia has conquered all these territories east and
Mm-hmm.
south. But they could also easily go, and then Russia will have a central Russian state, like, for example, with 100 million people, like Germany around in
Mm-hmm.
that, or Turkey, because the history of Turkey and Germany and ultimately Austria, where I come from, but it's just a very small country now.
Mm-hmm.
It is very much similar, but Serbia is a very good example for that one. When big empires fall, very often they go back into this kind of central state which has been dominating the rest. Yeah? You see
Right.
that in Germany, you see that in Austria to some extent, because Austria is a lot of the nobility of the former empire, and the rich
Mm-hmm.
people, they all fled to Vienna to be
Mm-hmm.
safe. And then the same you see in Turkey, where basically Turkey was building a nation state of Turks out of a multi-ethnic in their central part, and they moved their
Mm-hmm.
capital from Istanbul to Ankara. You see it in Serbia, that is today is still a very revanchist country, where basically they think it was wonderful to have Yugoslavia because they dominated it. And so now it's basically a 7 million state and not a 21 million state, but they are still full of revanchism. And you could see the same basically say for Russia today out of this Soviet Union. And Russia could shrink further towards a central Russian state with, let's say, approximately 100 million people. And there would be 20 new states forming in the south of Russia, today's Russian Federation, Tatarstan, for example, Kalmykistan, and many others. And it's quite useful for young students of diplomacy and politically interested to learn some of the states. And because I do this with my children from time to time, and I always question them, what's the capital of Kalmykistan, and what's the capital of Astrakhan, and what's the capital of this beautiful Buryatia? Obviously, nobody knows that so much. And you can say that this will never happen, but invite me next year and we will discuss about it, because nobody believed that Ukraine will make a war in Russia now, as they are doing. And everybody told me of these big political experts here on Twitter that the surprise on the battlefield is that Ukraine has already lost. It's impossible to defeat Russia. And now things are turning the table. The Ukrainians are turning the table. So a lot of things can happen. And the future I argue for is, of course, much better for the people of Chechnya to have an independent country.
Mm-hmm.
And that is much better than being under some kind of Islamist terrorist dictatorship of Kadyrov, who is basically one of the most crazy rulers of any
Oh,
entity in the
yes.
world.
There's no
So,
doubt about that. Well, let's talk about the war a little bit because we've passed the 2 year anniversary, and I can just speak from the American perspective. The enthusiasm for Ukraine in 2022 was really unlike anything I'd ever seen. And there was the, social media, everyone had a flag. There was a kind of return to great power politics as well, that where we need to support this group. There are definite enemies in the world like Russia. We have obligations. Let's talk about strategy, and let's kind of move beyond the domestic politics of the United States. It was remarkable, and there's a State of the Union address where Bono was there with Biden, and I thought we were back in the '80s. I think you two actually performed in Ukraine. Yeah, it was something. But that enthusiasm hasn't really been sustained. So the United States people unquestionably support Ukraine. And there are very strong elements on the right that are pushing back against that in a way that is sort of unbelievable for someone who's my age. I could never imagine that a Republican vice president would be saying, "I don't care what happens in Ukraine." JD Vance said that. He said that also in 2022. He didn't he maybe even saying it now is bad, but maybe a little bit more understandable. Saying that right when they're being invaded is incredible and depraved, really. And so you have that Tucker Carlson, he goes this way and that, but there's a general tendency to be pro Russia, et cetera. But over the past week, things and again, over the past year, things have kind of stabilized. There's talk of a frozen conflict, it's a stalemate, etc. But things have dramatically changed over the past week, and there's this incursion in Kursk where Ukraine is really pushing into Russian territory, which is extremely humiliating. Now, I don't think we should get ahead of ourselves and think that the war is going to be over tomorrow or anything, but it is a demonstration that the stalemate can be broken and that Russia, this narrative of Russia's just going to eventually win, you might as well just give up now. That narrative needs to go away. That this is proof against that. But so what are your feelings about where we are in the Ukraine conflict, and what do you see happening in the medium term? I mean, do you think that Russia is a kind of like a hollow enemy, that things are going to start happening faster, or do you think that this is going to be an extended campaign that we're going to have to deal with strategically for some time? What are your thoughts on what's happening right now and also in the foreseeable future?
Look, I was always clear in one thing. The West will always win. We won against the Kaiser, I remind you, and I say on Twitter always we, and I feel ideological as part of we, and that's
Mm-hmm.
basically the Western market democracies led by the United States. Yeah, you
Mm-hmm.
have defeated. I don't see myself genetically as somebody, my grandfather or great grandfather. Whenever both of my grandfather and my great grandfathers, they were on the wrong side. But I believe in being part of this we, you call it
Mm-hmm.
West. What it is Western market democracies. You defeated the Kaiser's authoritarian and militarism. You defeated the Nazis. You defeated, or we defeated, I like to call we
Mm-hmm.
defeated the Soviet Union and communism. We defeated Yugoslavian socialism, and we will also defeat Putinism. Why we do it? Because we have a broader basis of legitimacy. We are basically all our people. We are a lot, and we are also advanced in terms of technology, in terms of innovation, in terms of what kind of offer and of what kind of reality we can offer to our people. Because everybody can see what is the life in Russia. For the few, it's very good under Putin. For the most
Mm-hmm.
of the people, you see under what conditions they are ready to fight. If you give them $2,000, he's going to fight because he takes the risk, because he thinks it's a better offer than being very poor in Russia. And he's
Mm-hmm.
dying because our technology is ultimately absolutely lethal. And we are like 50 years ahead of what Russia has to offer in terms of technology. And there's a reason for it, because technology doesn't come from the sky, from somewhere else. It's the ingenuity and the studying and the people and the companies who have developed it for decades and decades. Yeah. And we are
Mm-hmm.
simply much more ahead in that one. And we will definitely win, also because ultimately wars are always won by the industrial fiscal capacity of nations. And we are basically almost unlimited in our capacity. We have not even started to take this war very seriously. I hear it also in your introduction, because you also talk about the conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, we have not declared war on Russia. We have
Right.
not taken the challenge. Yeah, we have not. We call it land lease. Yeah, you know what we're doing. Biden
Mm-hmm.
said we will mobilize land lease, and I understand it's the same kind of legal basis. Yeah, but what you have done for Ukraine was very important. You know, I say it was very important. Without America,
Mm-hmm.
Ukraine would have lost. There's also no doubt about that one.
Mm-hmm.
But compared to what you did in the terms of mobilization of resources to defeat the Soviet Union I'm talking about 7 trillion of estimated cost for winning the Cold War. And when I talk about the Second World War, in just 4 years, you have mobilized, I think, 4 trillion, which
Hmm.
is an enormous sum of money in today's world. Yeah. So in terms of what you have done now with the 100 billion which you sent over, most of all, also to be understood, the Americans especially sent military equipment, which is very important in a war. The Europeans, we have given 100 million basically mostly in cash in terms of supporting the Ukrainian state. So it's a difference, but both sides have done very well, and we have really merged our unity and our resolve to win this war in extreme matters, and I'm very happy with the result. When you ask me what is the result of the war, I cannot tonight in this evening say tomorrow it will be won or in 1 month.
Hmm.
We have to prepare the population and everybody for a very long war because ultimately this war has started already in 2014. So we are now
Hmm.
10 years. It goes into different phases. It's possible, with a new president, Trump, that we will go into some kind of freezing and we will have another 10 years of war. My current thesis of today is that Mr. Biden, he is a very good cold warrior. When you look at his
Hmm.
speeches about Yugoslavia, about Bosnia and Kosovo, he is now back to his spirits after he has lost this big burden on his shoulder of the re-election, which he never
Hmm.
was very sure about it. And he could push that now to Kamala. And he has now decided in the last 6 months of his presidency to win the war because he also doesn't think very highly of Kamala and she thinks she has no idea about winning wars. And that's probably true. So he has decided to take that off her shoulder and he will
Uh,
win this war in the next 6 months. And Putin has very bad
well,
luck.
that would be an amazing achievement. I think you might be onto something. I mean, for Joe Biden, always underestimated, but he defeated Trump in 2020. And if he can defeat Putin and focus on that, that would be an incredible achievement.
I
Someone
think
who
that's his
again is
plan.
always underestimated. I think that's really good to hear. What do you think about Trump? So I listened to Trump's kind of bizarre rambling, although I would say extremely entertaining space on Twitter last night. I guess early in the morning for you over in Central Europe. But um, my feelings about Trump and Ukraine are mixed because on the one hand, you could argue that Trump, he loves Putin, he loves Kim Jong Un, he loves any dictator. It's a different. He said at one point he was like, they love their country. It's just a different kind of love. So it's a different kind of love. I mean, that seems like the euphemism for a abuser. But anyway, um, he on the one hand, you could say that he's just going to write off Ukraine and give territory over. He doesn't care. He'll go and shake hands with Putin, etc. On the other hand, um, maybe it just even if it's just purely about egoism, he too would want to win and want to prove himself. I think maybe the kind of unlikely or curveball that, to use an American metaphor, sorry, but the curveball that you could imagine with Trump is that he's actually going to be pro-Ukraine. I mean, Trump offered lethal aid to Ukraine. Obama did not. This notion that Donald Trump is anti-Ukraine, I think a lot of people are seeing the opinions of J.D. Vance, Tucker Carlson, the so-called dissident right on Twitter and so on. Uh, excuse me.
Bless you.
That's not necessarily what Donald Trump will do. So I think it's a very interesting question about what he might be in office in 2025.
Yes, I agree with you. You are absolutely right. Trump, I don't like him for his personal antiques and his cool lifestyle, and I hope he
Hmm.
loses and retires. But that's my personal thinking. Whenever, he is also the representative of the Grand Old Party and the party of Ronald Reagan. And in the GOP, there are a lot of people who want, of course, to win, and he knows that very well. And also Trump, with all you can say against him, but Trump certainly doesn't want to go out of Ukraine as a loser. So some
Right.
kind of Afghanistan scenario, like running away, and then you have the same terrible pictures like 2021 chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, which Biden was happy to accept as a kind of fact just to get out of it. I think Trump would be horrified to have such a defeat, and he would certainly not go for it. And for Trump's world, and you have maybe read the Pompeo piece recently in the Wall Street Journal, and I say
Hmm.
this also since years. It's very easy to have peace immediately if the American president is ready to accept the free part of Ukraine in NATO and
Hmm.
say the rest is whatever. We give it in a legal limbo, and Russia occupies it now for some time, and we cannot change
Well, you
anything. But
can't
the rest,
join NATO with disputed territories.
you
But
know,
I guess
it's
there'd be some sort of
with
legalism that you could get
with
away
the
around that.
you know as a this beautiful organization which I love very
Yeah.
much, but you
Yeah.
know who is running it?
The
You
US, I don't
guys.
know who. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you
The
want to take
Nazis, according
no,
to
yes,
Jackson Hinkle. Yeah.
yeah, Jackson back again. But ultimately, if you are ready to take the responsibility for the eastern border of Ukraine, and that's the
Right.
reason why the Americans don't want to take this responsibility for the defense of the eastern border of Ukraine. And if you say this is the now Eastern Front, like you have done it in Eastern Germany, because
Hmm.
Germany was a divided country, and you said, hello, Soviet Union, this is your part, and we are taking this part into NATO in 1955, and then you put American troops to the German border, and you say, yeah, Mr. General McClay was the guy who was putting the tanks in Berlin, yeah, and
Yeah.
if you cross the border, we will nuke you, and basically that's it. And in a moment you would say that's the deal, and then the Germans could say very little, because if the American president really wants it, and this Trump is really wants it, then the Germans and the French would agree, and everybody else would shut up, and then Ukraine is in NATO, just 80%, and
Yeah.
there's peace.
Well, Gunther, you speak from my own heart. And I don't want to pat myself on the back, but in 2022, from then on, I have been arguing for a quote German solution to Ukraine, which was accepting some sort of division and basically saying we'll win it back later. But doing a no-fly zone over what would in effect be West Ukraine. And again, the German solution, not perfect. It was ultimately quite successful. And
Yes.
I I think the liberals in the Biden administration, I don't think wanted to do that because it was in a way too 20th century. They wanted to think, oh, let's give money to plucky Ukraine and they'll survive somehow. And they didn't want to take on the burden of Cold War hegemony, which you almost need to accept if we're going to win. And it's actually better in the long run, fewer people die than simply giving arms and weapons to Ukrainians.
I think, now we have 2.5 years of inconclusive war,
Yeah.
and it is almost 1 million people dead, roughly, yeah, and maybe a bit less, but somehow in that category, 1 million people is a lot, yeah. And we
Yes.
have about the costs for the European economy, American economy, in terms of energy system, rearmament, defense of Ukraine, support of Ukraine. We have reached certainly about 2 trillion US dollars, yeah, somehow, which is also a lot of money for 2.5 years war, yeah. And so
Hmm.
this is the reality. Yeah? A lot of people are dead, a lot of costs, yeah? And we have achieved pretty nothing ultimately, yeah? In terms, okay, Ukraine has more or less won because
Hmm.
it has defended its territory. That's of course important, but it would have been possible to have this German-style solution even in 2020 or 21 or
Yeah.
2019. And
Yeah.
it's just about NATO and the American defense guarantee for the eastern border. And the Ukrainians didn't like this. When I said this in Ukraine, I got a lot of angry response because they want to reconquer Crimea and liberate, of course. But if the Americans don't support it, that's anyhow just a dream. So ultimately, a German scenario would have been possible anytime after 2015. Obama was sleeping. It would have been
Yeah.
possible under Trump, and it would be possible under Biden. But you are not ready for that responsibility. And so ultimately, all these people, like my dear friend Jack Sullivan, who I insult on Twitter
Hmm.
every day, All these people say that, the big danger is why we shouldn't declare war is because of nuclear war. And
Right.
so this kind of doctrine of escalation management and don't provoke the Russians into nuclear war has led to the situation where the agent, the agency of Ukraine is so high that they take the weapons America has provided and go and attack Russia anyhow.
Mm-hmm.
And a country could theoretically really retaliate to their nuclear in a sense, yeah, which I don't
Mm-hmm.
think the Russian will do because they are not nuclear attacked, yeah. But nevertheless, the whole level of escalation management had led to the mega escalation of Ukraine fighting in Russian territory.
Right.
So here comes the end of escalation theory and all these people. Ultimately, what I always try to explain on Twitter as well, you Americans have to take responsibility for the free world. If you don't do, the world is getting completely in chaos. And anyhow, it results in a reality where you ultimately have to take responsibility. And that should
Yeah.
be the lesson from the First World War, Second World War, from the Cold War, from the Yugoslavian War, and from the Ukraine War. And as long as you're not ready for that, we will continue to have a very long war in Ukraine because I don't think that Ukraine ultimately can really defeat Russia because going to Moscow and capture Putin is
Mm-hmm.
a little bit above the resources of Ukraine. But so we will have now possible a counterattack. They will move back, then they will do some effort on Crimea liberation. And then Putin will again go to DEFCON 2. And then you will anyhow have to say on which side you are. Do you somehow deter Russian nuclear war by basically lifting up the nuclear escalation as well, which will calm them down? And, ultimately, the non-intervention of America in this war leads to much more risks and then to have a German settlement and NATO membership of Ukraine. And basically, for 40 years, we had no war with the Soviet Union. Whenever German and American and Soviet troops were standing basically in artillery distance or in Berlin in tank distance for 40 years head to head, but
Mm-hmm.
there was no war. And this is the much better solution.
I completely agree. I have one more question, and it's a little bit fun. And then, if you do have some time, maybe you could answer some questions from the audience as well. So, uh, I, I hope you take this in the right way. So we have a word that's on the internet in the United States called cringe, where oh, that's so cringe. It means sort of it's nerdy or dorky, it's uncool, but there's a point where cringe becomes cool in a way where you're so cringe that it's now awesome. And I you seem, and I mean this as a complete compliment, you seem willing to be cringe as hell in order to make a point, and you become cool as a result. So the kind of faces, like showing images of you lifting weights and then saying you're doing this for NATO expansion. I mean, it's hilarious, and I can understand how someone would be like, "Who is this guy? He's a lunatic or whatever." But I think it's actually awesome because you kind of leaned in to being just funny and out there, and you're comfortable with yourself. You're comfortable in your own skin, as we say, in English. So I think it's great. But have you consciously tried to do this? Like, did you, because you entered your 50s, you've been an economist and a geopolitician, and then you're like, all right, I've just got to get on social media and be stupid. Like, did you kind of think through it, or tell me about
No, there was no thinking.
it? No thinking. Okay, well, that's the best
It
kind of
was
thing.
no
Yeah.
strategy, whatever long-term planning. Yeah, I was sitting in Kiev and I got a bit bored. No, it was already. I was actually. I tell you how it all happened. Yeah, it was like this. Yeah, I have actually worked as a development consultant in the Ministry of Economy in Kiev, and I tried with full motivation in 2016-17 to reform, to contribute to the reform process. But everybody was against that. They said, "You cannot do that. You cannot do that. No, 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 no. This is all not going to happen." But I said it's totally normal. We did the same in Kosovo. I have not advised anything else. than we did in Kosovo, Albania, Macedonia. But for Ukraine, we were so careful. We said, no, you cannot do that. Yeah, you cannot do that. Yeah. And we cannot promote NATO, flat tax, Eurozation, and reforms. And so, because it's basically a neutral country, it's far away, it will never join the European Union. And how I said, how can we work when we can a country which wants to join the European Union? That was always clear. Ukraine wanted that after Euromaidan, and we are basically the European Union, and somebody wants to join us, but we don't want that, and we don't advise them like we should. So I said, this is a bit of a crazy world here. And then I decided to go on Twitter because it was a recommendation of one of my best buddies. Because before I was on Facebook active and I put everything on Facebook. And then I decided to go on Twitter. In the beginning, I had very big texts and so like I normally use. And then I remember it started in 2019. I started to put some photos on, and then I got more reaction because at the beginning nobody was interested in my things. And so gradually I started to put more of my private life up and more of the things. And I have a bit of a competition because I'm also in a circle of friends here in Austria, which are very pro-Ukrainian, and then they were also very interested. And we have basically then had a bit of a competition, and then I started to get more and more things up and out, and so I started to have more reach. And so I reached now my 60,000 follower status. And from time to time, when I release my non-perfect belly, it's getting
Well,
but
hey,
I
you're in your
started.
mid 50s and you're working out. There's nothing to be ashamed of, in my opinion.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. Thanks. And so
Yeah.
I do some things, and sometimes it's entertainment, sometimes it's too much. I always have to ask if I involve, and I'm careful. I basically do it just myself, and I don't involve my family or others
Sure.
into that. And so, and then, some things happened, the war has also changed a lot because with the war, because I was thinking to go to fight, but ultimately
Mm.
a 56-year-old Austrian non-commissioned military officer from a neutral country where this is a crime to go to fight and nobody really invited. And all my friends said, Gunther, it's okay if you stay because we
Yeah.
anyhow know what we do and you can do nothing. So I decided to do more on cyber and to do this Twitter. I have my YouTube channel and I basically, and my podcast and also my Twitter feed. And so I somehow leaned a bit in as well. You're right. My wife says also from time to time it's a bit cringy, and so I crossed this line because I'm not a politician ultimately. And I try also to get some attention with this one. I try also
Hmm.
with my holiday pictures. And so I try to entertain because ultimately politics is entertainment. I try to make the case that I'm a total normal person. And I
Hmm.
just feel very passionate about Ukraine, about Kosovo, and about NATO. And I want to also have some reach out here in my things. And it's
Hmm.
anyhow not easy when you are from Austria, the smaller countries. It's in America, it's a big country with so and so many, I think 240 million people. You can easier reach kind of larger scale. But in this one, that's why I tweet in English and I try to reach one. And I have this self-declared task to get as many followers as the mainstream politicians have. My party
Hmm.
leader, and there's one party leader who has 62,000 followers, and I have 60,000. So I want to catch up this year with him and overtake him. And that's my.
Right. You also have real followers as opposed to robots like Mr. Hinkle.
Oh,
So
I don't
that's
know where
also an
he's getting the
achievement.
money from his millions of followers, but
Yeah, we'll see what happens to
anyhow,
him.
he's now in
Um,
Venezuela, and I hope he stays there. And after the revolution, they will send
yeah,
him back
right.
to the
Why would
United
he want to
States.
leave when there's a revolutionary communist in charge? I mean, why would you come back to capitalism? I don't understand.